This is a little bit of Episcopal trivia, which you might know and you might not. During the season that we call the season after Pentecost, we continue to have three readings, right? An Old Testament, an Epistle, and a Gospel. But in the Old Testament, there are two tracts. You who've been Episcopalians for a long time are familiar with what is called Tract 2, which takes an Old Testament lesson and correlates it with the Gospel. Right? You're familiar with that? Sure. Tract 1, which came about with the Revised Common Lectionary, does something different. It tries to give you a continuous sequence of readings over a certain period of history in the Old Testament. Now, because the Old Testament is large and long, you don't cover it all, but you try to get more of a continuous story than you would normally get with Tract 2. So, for year A, which we are part of, in which the Old Testament lesson from Exodus came from, it tries to deal with the early history of the children of Israel up until the time of the kings. So, at the very beginning, it had one lesson about Noah, because that's right in the beginning, right? And then there's several lessons pertaining to Abraham. And then it goes on from Abraham to a nod to Isaac. And then we get that scoundrel Jacob, and we have several stories about Jacob. And then there's Joseph. And then finally there's a number of readings relating to Moses, because Moses was the icon of liberation from slavery in Egypt and then wandering through the wilderness. So we had today one of those wilderness stories. Now, how many of you have actually spent time wandering in a wilderness? Well, we have one or two. I spent 2 months in a wilderness area called the McCormick Wilderness Area up in the UP. It is not a wilderness that is devoid of water, because there's no place in Michigan that's devoid of water. Now, it might take some skill to find the good water, clean water, but it's available. But if you've spent any time wandering around in a desert wilderness in the Southwest, water is a pretty critical thing. And if you don't know where water is and you're out in the wilderness, you're going to die. So it gives a little bit of an understanding of this text about the people in the wilderness, in the desert wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, not having water. And when you don't have water and there's a leader of it, what happens? You start throwing stones at the leader, don't you? Or you get pretty mad. Verbal stones. Because after all, the leader should know. So it gives an understanding to this particular text about wandering in the wilderness, and Moses, who should have known, didn't get them to the place where there was water. And that's a pretty critical thing. So when you hear these stories about the wandering in the wilderness, and you want to say in your mind, oh, these children of Israel, they're such a stubborn bunch, and they're always complaining, well, maybe what they were complaining about was fairly legitimate. Because finding water, finding food, and not had any experience with it, it takes some doing. So that's the first lesson, and I just want to make you aware that these children of Israel weren't such bad people after all. They were just quite human. So now from that we get to the gospel reading. It begins with the leaders of the temple saying what? By what authority are you doing these things? What's these things referring to?
Healing the sick. Healing.
Well, there were healing stories, but they wouldn't be so vexed about that unless it was done on the Sabbath day. If you read the beginning of this chapter 21 of Matthew, a big event happens. Two things. According to Matthew's chronology, Jesus spent all of his time up country. All of his healing ministry, all of his speeches, we've heard those speeches, all happened up country. Finally, he gets to Jerusalem. And first of all, he gets into Jerusalem staging a counter parade to the governor who's coming in from the west. We call it the triumphal entry. It was not a triumphal entry, it was an entry that was challenging the power of the state. That's a big event. The next event, he comes into the temple, and according to Matthew, he has what is called the cleansing of the temple. Right there on that first day when he enters into Jerusalem. Mark, who does a better chronology, has it on the second day. Well, those are two pretty big events. He's challenging the political power, and he's challenging the religious hierarchy. So no wonder they say, by what authority are you doing these things? Because Jesus is coming in and confronting the power struggle. So it's a good question. It's a legitimate question. So then Jesus, who recognizes that there's a little trap here, does a counter. It's very clever. You tell me the answer to this question, then I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. Now, you can recognize the trap that they try to have for Jesus. If he says the authority is his own, then what kind of legitimacy is that? If he says it's from God, that could be blasphemous. So he goes to the story of John the Baptist, because he knows that John the Baptist was highly regarded, and says, was John the Baptist doing what he did because he was just a person, or was it from God? And we hear the story about why they don't understand, or why they don't want to respond. So that's the background to this parable. The parable of the two sons. It's a very simple parable. The landowner, the vineyard owner, says to the one, go and work in the vineyard. And he says, what? No. I got other plans to do. I'm going to go ride my bike or something like that. But then he thinks about it and decides to go. And then the owner says to the second son, will you go into the vineyard today? And he says, oh yes, I'll go. And he doesn't go. Now, which which one of these two do you think you are more likely to be? Be careful. Because if you're honest with yourself, you've done both. You've said, I'm going to do something, and then, busyness comes along and you don't do it. And then you said you're not going to do something, and then you really think about it, and you think, oh, why did I say that? And you decide to do it afterward anyway. But that was really not the punchline that Jesus was trying to do with the scribes and Pharisees. And incidentally, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has conflict with the religious leaders throughout, beginning about the middle of the Gospel of Matthew. But it's only until he gets into Jerusalem, at the heart, if you wish, of the religious hierarchy, does this conflict become acute and eventually results in his arrest and trial and crucifixion. So what does Jesus conclude this parable with? The prostitutes and tax collectors are getting into the kingdom before you. Now the religious leaders, they would be the ones we'd say are going to get into the kingdom, right? I mean, it's like deacons and priests. They ought to get there first. And Jesus says, no, it's the tax collectors and prostitutes. And of course, tax collectors and prostitutes were way down at the bottom of the religious hierarchy. They were bad people, we knew that. But they were the ones that were getting into the kingdom. So, what do we make of that story? Well, we ought to be careful how we think we are so good. I mean, we Episcopalians are pretty good at that anyway. Because we've been good people. We do the right stuff. And if we have that kind of arrogance, we're getting close to the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees thought they had it made. They thought they had it in. And Jesus challenges them. And so it's a wake-up call for us in terms of what we think about ourselves and how much we acknowledge our own fallenness, our own failures, our own need of salvation, our own need to be redeemed. Because if we come at it from any other perspective, we're coming at it in the same way the Pharisees